In the year of 2066, the world was in turmoil. The Middle East was ravaged, devastated by a brutal conflict with the European powers to lay claim to their oil fields. Despite being the victor, Europe was embroiled in further conflict as the countries of the region began to fight amongst each other for resources. And worst of all, China had launched a daring amphibious landing in Alaska, declaring war against the United States in order to possess the Alaskan oil fields for their own. Having recently been invaded, international perception viewed the United States as a victim, with China acting as the aggressor. However, any form of empathy began to be eroded as the United States used the opportunity to their advantage and began one of the greatest betrayals of the post-war world, the annexation of their closest ally and friend, Canada. Years earlier, in 2059, the United States had pressured its neighbour in the north to allow its troops to be stationed across the country, in what was described as a purely security role. The Alaskan pipeline crisscrossed across Canada in its journey to provide cheap and abundant fuel to its citizens. However, to safeguard its interests, the US did not consider Canadian troops to be enough, with American forces needed to be utilised. Given the special relationship between the two, Canada begrudgingly gave their support. However, as times became tough, the once solid friendship between the two began to break down. As mentioned before, in 2066, China had invaded Alaska and laid claim to a significant chunk of the state. Needing to secure their territory, the US began to pressure Canada to allow more of their military and equipment into the country, citing security reasons. The US elaborated that they were fighting on behalf of Canada, given that they would be China's next target, and explained that the troops would only be there to travel through to Alaska and/or stationed to protect their supply lines. However, as the old saying goes, never let a good crisis go to waste. With American troops firmly in place across all of Canada, the US began to lay claim to Canada's natural resources, explaining that they needed to do so in order to stop China from pillaging their natural resources in Alaska. Irony seemed to be another casualty lost in the war. An incredible stretch of Canada's forests were torn down, with the natural beauty of its timberland fueling the American war machine. Other resources such as oil, water, and food were also appropriated for the American war effort. By 2069, Canadians were increasingly fed up with what was now obviously viewed as an unofficial occupation, with Canadian protests erupting across the nation. Such protests culminated into armed insurrections against the American occupiers. Entire Canadian cities hosted rioters and protesters hostile to the American forces. However, the climax came when the Alaskan pipeline, the entire reason for the original US military presence, was the victim of an attempted sabotage. The US were quick to label it the work of Canadian terrorists who were hell-bent on preventing America from ousting the Chinese. Some in the military even theorized that perhaps the Canadians were in league with the communist forces this whole time. Skeptical Canadians, and even some Americans, found it very convenient that the most heavily protected stretch of land in Canada was able to suffer an attempted sabotage by what was described as inefficient terrorists. Whatever the case, the attempted sabotage gave the US all the pretext they needed to begin official proceedings for the annexation of Canada. An archived news article from the Capital Post on June 3, 2072 reads the following: US to annex Canada. In a move that is being widely viewed as both necessary and overdue, the United States military today declared that they will begin the immediate annexation of the country of Canada. The decision comes after a long and contentious relationship with the Canadian government that began shortly after the Chinese invasion of Anchorage, Alaska, in the winter of 2066. The Canadian leadership at that time expressed its opposition to American troops passing through their country or traversing their airspace, but ultimately capitulated. Tensions with our neighbour to the north have only escalated since then, as the United States has found itself relying heavily on Canada's natural resources, including wood cultivated from the country's great timberland forests, to maintain the war effort against China. But it was a recent near sabotage of the Alaskan pipeline that finally tipped the American military's hand.
You know what's been stopping the Reds from pouring into downtown Juneau? American soldiers, that's what. And now we've got to worry about someone, Chinese, Alaskan, or otherwise, taking out the pipeline. I don't think so. Effective immediately, United States troops are beginning a complete takeover of all Canadian assets and resources. Little America is ours, but let's face it, it always has been.
Although striving to defend their country, Canada's military force was incredibly stretched to the breaking point as they sought to overthrow the largest military force in the known world. From the announcement in 2072 to 2076, conflict raged between the two former allies as its people sought to liberate itself from American rule. However, the Canadian government eventually capitulated to its southern neighbour, as its once plentiful resources were used against them by their occupiers. In January 2076, Canada ceased to exist as a nation. The United States annexed the whole country and declared the provinces of the former nation now under United States rule. Long-term ally of the US government, Vault-Tec, used the opportunity to announce new Vault opportunities in Canada. However, the Canadian provinces were not granted equal status as the states of the US, instead just being considered US territories. Despite its official capitulation, many Canadians never gave up the fight against the Americans. Protesters and rioters continued to engage the US occupiers, and the Alaskan pipeline swarmed with American military units. The Yukon was described as being an incredibly devastating front, as Canadian Liberator forces sought to grind down the US troops just outside of the Alaskan frontline. However, now considering Canadian aggression as an insurrection rather than outright combat, the US began to crack down hard. Post-annexation, the US propaganda machine had gone into overdrive. Newsreels shown on primetime television showed power armor-clad US forces executing Canadians in the streets, while the announcers declared that our dedicated boys keep the peace in newly annexed Canada. Comic series such as Tales from the Front were launched to show that American violence up north was a good and noble pursuit. A popular children's cartoon, Armor Ace and the Power Patrol, contained Canadian villains known as the Yukon 5, with their character biography reading, "In the wake of American liberation of the Yukon Territory, a damaged Assaultron uploads its consciousness into a suit of T-45 power armor and is reborn as Commissioner Chaos. The rogue AI forms the Yukon 5, a group of anti-imperialist robots which threaten to halt the march of Manifest Destiny. They serve as antagonists in the series, combating Armor Ace and the Power Patrol." The images and footage of the atrocities against Canadians did not sit well with all Americans. Even some military members such as Randall Clark viewed the annexation as a criminal act. Civil unrest erupted in the US, with dissidents put down as harshly as Canadian protesters. With the Chinese forces dislodged from Alaska in January 2077, US forces were reallocated for more domestic purposes in the mainland US, but also in occupied Canadian territories. The resisting enclaves of Canada began to fall one by one as the full might of the US military quashed all forms of hostility to the American liberation effort. Canada remained firmly in the hands of Uncle Sam until the Great War occurred on October 2077. With it, occupied Canada ceased to be, since the occupying United States of America also ceased to exist as a nation. Past this, our sources on Canada become frayed and varied. Some Canadians eventually travelled into the post-war wasteland of the former United States, given the fact that borders no longer meant anything. The cancelled game of Fallout Extreme also planned to explore the former territories of Canada, such as the Great Convocation and the Montauk Preserve, with Inuit and Montauk Native Americans appearing to have survived the Great War in enough numbers to serve as factions. Canonically, Toronto is stated to have survived in some form, being referred to as Ronto. Two characters seen in the pit will mention Ronto, with a slave named Brand and its leader declaring that the pit will be the envy of Ronto. Lastly, a part of Canada can be destroyed during the events of Mothership Zeta. If the death ray is activated, a terrible energy burst launches down onto Earth, with the target location indicated to be Algonquin Provincial Park. While no other information is revealed, the surface area of the explosion and the visible shockwave would no doubt have killed thousands, if not tens of thousands, of Canadian wastelanders, who had probably thought that their days of suffering at the hands of Americans were long past. In conclusion, the American annexation of Canada was one of the most disturbing parts of the Resource and Sino-American War. War is always ugly, but it's especially so when a former ally, one that had maintained such a solid relationship for centuries, is destroyed in the bid to win a war against a hostile country. The Americans could disguise the liberation of Little America as much as they wanted, but to the Canadians who had their country stolen from them, they were able to see the simple truth of what it was: a betrayal.